So, we finally made it. We've reached the peak. This is My Hero Academia's peak animation. And I'm here to talk about it because this is my breakdown and review for My Hero Academia, Season 7, Episode 8. Let's do this. Hey guys, how's it going? It is your boy, Manga Andrew, and I'm here to talk about the most recent episode of My Hero Academia, Season 7, Episode 8. And as I alluded to, this episode freaking is amazing. From the animation to the story points to everything that was added to this episode makes this probably one of, if not the best episode of My Hero Academia so far. And I'm here to break down the stuff that you may or may not notice within the episode and just give you a better understanding for why this episode is so great. So, let's dive right into the breakdown. And to start off, this episode covers once again 3 chapters, chapters 350, 351, and 352. And the title of this episode actually derives itself from chapter 351, which is 2 Flash Fires. And the episode actually begins with us seeing a gorilla-like officer talking to Dr. Garaki about Dabi and kind of explaining and getting into a little bit more for why Dabi is here and why he was picked, because it is revealed that the reasoning why Dabi is the way that he is that he may be warped, as well as he was being used as a vessel. And later on within the episode, it is explained that this is something that All For One planned, where he was going to use people like Dabi who are warped to the extent of Tomoe Shigaraki to be the next vessel of All For One for him to take over and eventually live on forever. But even there, this is where we actually get the start of some added scenes that were not necessarily in the manga, but were implied within it. For example, there's a scene in anime where we see Burnin, Kido, as well as Onoma jumping in to try and protect Shoto, which is going to build upon what we see later on after we get a chunk of flashback for why they were in front of him in the first place. As well as we get hints to Shoto's new ability as we see that there is a different colored flame on his chest, implying that it's going to act differently than his normal fire. But something else that we get from the manga that is added upon in the anime is the expansion of Toya's death scene, where we get to see it in a lot more detail in comparison to what we saw in the manga, as well as we get to see the actual explanation of how Toya was able to put out the flames by jumping into the river. And how in the manga, it is implied that he jumped into a body of water, but we actually see in the actual anime that he jumps into a small river right before it's revealed that All For One was the one that picked him up and pretty much saved him on that day. Where we get a little bit more into the flashback as well, where we do have the scene of Toya waking up in a hospital bed in what we're assuming is an orphanage due to the fact of how many kids are in here, as well as the fact that this is something that was hinted at in season 6 during the hospital raid, where it's implied that Dr. Garaki not only had multiple hospitals under his control, but also nursing homes as well as orphanages, where it pretty much is built upon the idea that he had these locations not only just to get quirks from individuals, but also just to hold the vessels that could possess All For One in the future. So it is a small detail for this, but what's even more interesting is how they were able to convey Toya changing over the 3 years that he was in a coma. Where at this moment in the story, we hear Toya speaking in a younger voice, but as soon as he speaks physically, we see that his voice has deepened, most likely because he's gone through puberty during the time he was unconscious. So I really like that is something that the anime did to really distinguish how Toya is still in the mindset of a child, even though his body is more of that of a young teenager. But even with that, we do get some hints that maybe at this point, Toya could have changed and not evolved into the Dabi that he was, as he wanted to apologize for all of the hardships that he put not just Endeavor but his mother through. But unfortunately, he's confronted by Sunny telling him that he cannot leave the orphanage, where it's revealed that from the manga in the anime that the individual talking on the monitor is most likely All For One. And how he pretty much reveals to Toya that he's basically looking like a different person and that they had to do a lot of work to keep him alive, but that his flames will never be as strong as they were prior, but that they're here to teach him and that they will be the ones training him. And this suggestion sets Toya off and implies that he potentially burned down the orphanage as we see him attacking Sunny with the fire. And it's also around this time where it's revealed that Toya, like many others in the orphanages, were going to be used as vessels just in case Tomoe Shigaraki failed. But something that I want to add in this scene to kind of clarify it is that we do have an explanation for what happened to the orphanage, as we do see a scene of Toya running away as the building is on fire, while also getting the added scenes of him walking and wandering around as he's actually looking for the Todoroki home. And the point that I want to bring up is that in the manga, and with extra information conveyed about this scene, Horikoshi confirms that what happened is that Dr. Garaki was the one that actually burnt down the actual orphanage and blamed it on Sunny. And that by doing so, it caused the police to not have suspicion thrown upon him, which was able to allow him to escape without being caught. So while it's implied that potentially Dabi did burn down the actual orphanage, he started the fire that was put out, but eventually led to it being burnt down anyway by Dr. Garaki. So that's some cool information to know, just to add a little bit more shading to Dabi's character, or Toya's character, at this moment. But even within, we also get a very interesting flashback within this flashback where we get the confirmation that because Dr. Garaki knew Toya Dabi prior, that he did try to introduce him and try to understand how he was able to survive, since he was supposed to die because his body wasn't meant to last as long, with the implication that resentment is keeping him alive. As this leads into Toya revealing that he was able to arrive back home, as we get the moment added of him approaching the Todoroki household, while we also get the scene of him looking upon his father unchanging will, really shaking him to his core, believing that his family forgot about him, with a scene that is very much clearly shown in the anime of him looking from the outside of the door, showing just how close he was to Endeavor, versus what we see in the manga, where the clarity of where he is in that moment is not very clear. But as we begin to cut back to the present, I will want to point out, and this isn't going to be the last time I point this out, the animation of this episode is done extremely well, as we see the flames on Toya's arm begin to burn off his skin, very much like in the manga, but it's implemented so well where you're able to see it done in such a smooth transition. As we also, in the next part, see some added scenes not necessarily shown in the manga but implied, how Toya was able to learn about Endeavor's abilities and fighting style by watching him on a laptop. Something that is not necessarily shown in the manga but implied, but we get a clear scene of it in the anime, which I'm glad that they added. And it's from here where we begin to get the true explanation of not just the title of the episode, but the real core of the Todoroki family, which is Endeavor striving for greater heights, as we have Endeavor striving for greater heights, as we get revealed for how he was able to create the Flashfire Fist at such a young age, and how we're going to be seeing two individuals in this fight using it in two different ways. And it's from this moment on and into the rest of this episode where we have peak animation from My Hero Academia, where we do have a lot more added scenes of Toya discovering how to use his fire and being able to make it blue, which is something that is kind of absent from the manga visually. But it's from here where we see Toya use his flash fire, using Hell Spider to begin the fight in earnest. And I will say that something that is different from the Hellfire in the manga versus the anime is that in the anime, it looks less like fire and more like lightning, which is actually more akin to spiderwebs than just large crossing pillars of fire. As well as we do see the characters, the other heroes of Burnin and the others, being able to withstand the attack, but unfortunately seemingly to use the Hell Spider as a distraction to get behind Shoto before he can actually activate his ability proper. And I will point out that from what we see in the anime versus what we see in the manga, this is a more physical fight in the anime versus the manga. While yes, in the manga, we do see that Dabi does land a few hits on Shoto physically, in the anime, he's just beating this child just with his fist, causing him to bleed, versus what we saw in the manga. And this really just shows just how much hatred is inside of Toya at this moment, just beating his younger brother senselessly, not with fire, but with his own physical fists. And as Dabi is explaining his ideals about Shoto, about how he's a doll and that he'll never amount to nothing, sending him flying with a jet burn into a building, we do have a lot of characterization from Shoto. Not just here, but with the rest of this episode, him confirming the thoughts that Toya had, but also calling him out about how everything that he did was something understandable from what happened with Endeavor, but yet he still chose to kill people. And how we get a slight deviation from the manga and the anime of Dabi recognizing exactly what Shoto is doing, nullifying his fire with his new ability that is revealed to be phosphor. And I will say that throughout this episode, the flashbacks are cut in a way that is a little smoother in the anime than it was in the manga, having the flashbacks more or less come together as one before revealing phosphor versus what is saw in the anime where we get a flashback, the reveal of phosphor, and then another flashback. The flashbacks are combined into a more one singular coherent scene. And with this scene, this is where we get a better understanding of how phosphor works, as Shoto is explaining it to Deku right before they're able to go into the bath, where we see that the actual fire on his ice side is actually cold, and how it has a distinctive color compared to his normal fire, and how he explains it to be the circulation of blood in his body as his heart is the center to reach equilibrium, and how Deku explains it to be like cold flames or a cold fire, which is something that actually exists in our real world. You can, in theory, make fire cold because fire isn't the concept of heat, but the releasing of energy. And energy can be released at both higher and lower temperatures. So it's something cool to think about when it comes to how this makes sense biologically, since quirks are biological things within the world of My Hero Academia. But yes, with this character development, we get a lot of Shoto explaining that he's the one who wanted to go up against Dabi, and that Endeavor needed to go up against All For One, and that this is the choice that he wants to make. As we see the actual proper reveal of Phosphor, I will say that I do like the coloration differences. How it's not necessarily as blue as Dabi's fire, but that it has a more greenish bluish tint. Some could say teal, which causes the lighting and the dynamics in this episode to just pop out a lot more than normal. And as we get a new move using this flash fire, Icebound Crash, Cold Flame, Pale Blade, it's able to send Dabi back, but unfortunately it does not finish him off, as Dabi releases a burst of fire from the ground that actually incapacitates Burnin, Onima, as well as Kido, where in the manga it is a little bit more gruesome, as you can see that they have been substantially burned in comparison to the manga, but it doesn't stop Shoto from using one final attack to potentially take out Toya for all. Because as we get the final moments of Shoto going through character development and realizing that Class 1A always cared about him and never left him behind, we get the final attack of Great Glacial Eiger, and this animation was done to perfection, where we do not see necessarily the ice itself encroaching on the surrounding areas. We get a big explosion of white light, which makes sense because it is fire even though it's cold, but we also get to see that within that white light, we get to see both Shoto as well as Toya as children, which is taken directly from the manga, but it's used a lot more effectively in this moment, being incorporated into the actual attack instead of just being separated as a whole. As we get a panning scene of all of the buildings being frozen, as we assume that Toya is defeated, falling and slumping over Shoto. And as the previews depict that the next episode may be just as good, if not better than this one, as we're approaching on the fight between All For One, Endeavor, and Hawks. But yeah, overall, this was an amazing episode, from the storytelling, animation, even the music that I can't really show y'all was done to perfection. The atmosphere this episode created really just adds to the weight of how important this conflict is, not just to the world, but to the characters involved. But yeah, those are my thoughts and my breakdown and review of this episode of My Hero Academia. And let me ask you this, how'd you feel about the episode? Did you like it? Did you dislike it? Do you think that this is the best animation scene in My Hero Academia? Leave your thoughts down below, and also leave anything down below if I missed anything in my actual breakdown. Do all that cool jazz, and hopefully I'll be able to catch you in my next video. Goodbye!